Hey, are your marriage boundaries causing more confusion than clarity? If so, you're not alone. Many Christian couples struggle with the idea of boundaries, sometimes mistaking them for walls or selfishness. But what if actually healthy boundaries were the secret to love and deeper respect and stronger intimacy in your Christ centered relationship? So today we're going to cut through the confusion. We're going to reveal some biblical truths about boundaries. I'm going to help you put some good boundaries in place, some healthy boundaries. I want to educate you to help you understand what they are. So this is going to be great. But before we jump in, I want to make sure that you like, follow, hit that subscribe button wherever you are listening or watching this. And it will help you get all the great content that we have to offer. And it will also help us be able to get the message out to more people. So, what are boundaries? Again, people often confuse boundaries in relationships with something negative. When somebody gets mad, I'm putting a boundary in place and I'm not going to allow you to be mad at me anymore. And that's not exactly what that is. It can be something that's good and something that's healthy. And I don't look at it as walls that we're building, because walls, again, keep people out. It keeps us from connecting with our spouse. But really think about boundaries as more of property lines in relationships. So they're lines that are drawn. People have the ability and the free will to walk over those lines, of course, but the boundaries come into place when we think and talk about, okay, what are we going to do about that when that does happen? And again, boundaries are not about controlling your spouse. It's really about just managing your own space, your own responses. Again, they're not selfish. It's an act of self-care and respect, I think, for both individuals. And again, boundaries define what you are, what you're responsible for, what you will and will not tolerate. Again, it's hard to really put a boundary in place to stop a behavior or to stop a thing from happening, but it's more about what are my boundaries as far as what am I going to do and how am I going to react and respond. And if we think about boundaries in the Bible, go no further than God. You think about Genesis chapter 2, when he was actually talking to Adam and Eve about saying, hey, you're free to eat from any tree, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So that was the boundary line. Now, again, as I talked about before, Adam and Eve had free will. They could eat from whatever tree they wanted to. But God said, this is a boundary that I put into place, and here's some potential consequences for eating from that tree. And they made the decision, I guess Eve made the decision, to be tempted by the serpent, Satan, and eat from the tree. And so they crossed over that boundary that God had put in place for them. But on the other side, when Jesus came into the picture, he modeled healthy behaviors. I think a lot about when he would go off and pray, when he would, before he was crucified on the cross, he went to the Garden of Gethsemane and spent some time in prayer and quiet time. And that was his boundary of when I'm under stress or when things are difficult, I'm going to take some time to pray. And so he really modeled for us what it was like to have good boundaries. And when I think about the foundation for boundaries and what God and Jesus has laid out for us in our marriage, they're not saying we need to tolerate harmful behavior. So that's not, if there's any kind of abuse or anything like that, again, a boundary means, okay, what am I going to do about that? It means I'm going to get myself to safety, or I'm going to remove myself from the situation, or I'm not going to stay in this relationship until you get the help that you need. And again, your spouse can make that decision for themselves. They can decide if this is something that they want to do. They have free will as well. And so I really think that boundaries promote personal responsibility, not only on you who are implementing the boundary, but also the person that you're suggesting the boundary to. And I will say, with marriage, it's not necessarily necessary to verbalize all of your boundaries. Like you walk around and say, I'm not going to tolerate this and I'm not going to tolerate that. And here's what I'm going to do if you do this. And when you do a lot of that, then it can become a situation where, okay, is our relationship about rules And as we know, Jesus came not because we needed to follow a bunch of rules, but because we need to be led by love, of course. And so I want you to kind of keep that in mind, keep that in balance when we're talking about these boundaries. Because sometimes, again, you don't necessarily need to verbalize a boundary. It might be something that you just have in your mind. When my spouse gets angry at me, I'm going to let them know that hurt my feelings. And it might not be a case where you need to say, hey, going forward, every time you get angry with me, I'm going to let you know. Now, if it continues to happen, that might be something that you do need to think about and communicate. But sometimes boundaries don't necessarily need to be communicated, they can just happen. So, why are boundaries essential in marriage? I think number one, they clarify expectations. And then, at least for me, I've noticed if you communicate with me up front about a situation, like I know Heather and I, if we go to a party, for example, and maybe we've got something personal and private going on that we're not really sure, is one of us okay with sharing and the other's not? Maybe it's a medical issue. We might, if it's something pretty big, we'll have a dialogue about it and we'll talk and say, hey, is this okay for me to share? And if I say that to Heather and she says, I'm not really ready for that, I don't want that, then that's a boundary she's putting in place. Now, again, as I've said repeatedly as we've been talking, I have the free will to go ahead and say what I want to say to anybody, but there could potentially be consequences for that. But again, they set expectations. I think they also protect your identity and your emotional well being within the union. Again, if it's hurtful for things to be shared outside the marriage regarding my personal health, mentally or physically, then I'm actually communicating that with my spouse that, hey, this is going to be healthier for me if we can keep this within the marriage. I think it also helps prevent unhealthy codependency, fosters a mutual respect. That way we're not, again, when when the boundary lines aren't there and or they're not communicated, sometimes we can fuse together and we don't know what's my space, what's your space. So again, that's another healthy. I think healthy limits build trust. Again, by establishing consequences for harmful actions. So again, if I've communicated that, hey, for example, if you have an affair, then we're going to be going to couples therapy, or I'm going to leave you, then hey, I know if that's what I decide to do, or if that's what you decide to do, this is what's going to be happening. So I think and I know that's a kind of an example that's pretty elevated and high up there, but I mean, hopefully you're not facing that or have not faced that. But if you do, or if there's potential, then it might be good to communicate that. And then I think too, just it's good to really let your spouse know what's important to you and what's acceptable to you, what's not acceptable to you. And I would encourage you just do it in love, of course. Make sure you're kind and gentle. And again, it's not about throwing the hammer down because as we know, Jesus modeled for us truth and love, which means that yes, I need to speak the truth, but I need to do it in love. And sometimes people will often tell me, because I said this thing, I'm saying this because I love you. But if you're not tempering it with kindness and patience and care and love and gentleness and peace, then I would argue that you're not really sharing something in love, being quite harsh about it. So make sure you think about that as you're sharing. So, what about some common areas where boundaries are needed? And these are things that I've seen over and over again in the time that Heather and I have worked with couples. Our time and energy. Maybe we need some personal space. Maybe we need some downtime. Maybe it's okay to flip on the TV or read a book. And maybe our wants to be active and wants to go somewhere and do something. On occasion, it's okay just to say, you know what? I just need a little bit of quiet time before we get into whatever. And I've seen this too with a lot of couples where somebody will get home from work and just be exhausted and maybe they need 15 minutes just to unwind. Maybe they need to go take a shower or again, maybe read a book or maybe pray. And this can be tough. This is not easy when you have one parent that's a stay-at-home parent and the other parent works outside the home, because a lot of times when that spouse comes in and is just exhausted from the day at work and they want some downtime, typically the one that stays home with the kids is also ready for a break. So that one's not easy. That one might take some dialogue, some negotiation. Maybe it could be a situation where, hey, on, I don't know, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, when I get home from work, I get to have my 15 minutes of alone time or whatever. And then on Tuesdays and Thursdays, when I get home from work, you being the stay at home parent, you get your 15 minutes or 30 minutes of just alone time. Again, it takes some negotiation, which is, again, all about boundaries. Finances is also an area where clear boundaries are useful. And it could be things like, what's the dollar limit of things that I can purchase without communicating with you? And then, or it could be, how much will we go into debt? Are you okay with any kind of debt, no debt? Where are we at with that? So finances are a big one for sure. Boundaries, again, proactive communication. It's all about talking about it before the proverbial what hits the fan. In-laws and extended family, that's another area where I often see it's good to discuss how things are going. We've seen lots of situations where, let's say you go to your in-laws and maybe they start to pile on a little bit to your spouse who's their child. What do you do in that situation? Do you sit quietly? Do you not want to rock the boat? Do you want to let them handle it? Do you jump in to rescue your spouse or to have their back? I would say that would be where you would want to have a conversation again with your spouse about what's the appropriate behavior to do, because your spouse may say, oh my gosh, yes, I need your help. Whenever my father starts to get on me about whatever this issue in my life, yes, I need you to come to my rescue. Or they might say, you know what, it's best, let me handle it. I can usually know how to de-escalate the conversations with them as long as you just sit quietly. I think that would be for the best, because then we de-escalate it and it wouldn't get to be a problem. But again, it could be different for different people. So that's, again, another area to have a conversation. Say, okay, what's the boundary here? What do you want me to do when it comes to these issues? Again, do you want me to, quote unquote, have your back, come to your rescue? Do you want me to sit quietly, stay back? Communication, which kind of envelops all of everything that we're talking about, is a very important part of your relationship to have boundaries in. And it might be that, hey, we're not going to yell, we're not going to name call. I know in Ephesians 4:29 it talks about not letting any unwholesome talk come from your mouth, but only what is helpful for building others up. That's important to remember when it comes to communications. I know name calling is a big one. John Gottman, famous couples researcher, talks about how he calls it contempt. It's one of the four horsemen that he talks about. He says contempt is the worst one of the four. The others are criticism, defensiveness, and stonewalling. Contempt is really basically like, I'm looking at you as if you're about 2 inches tall when I call you a name. And again, not to make excuses, but typically the reason that we do that, usually we're frustrated, we're irritated, we don't feel like we're being heard. You know what? Maybe I'll call you a name and you'll listen. And of course, we know that's not going to help the situation. Maybe it helps you feel better, you get it off your chest. But the problem is, you're probably not going to get back what you're looking for when it comes to that. So I would encourage you to be careful with that one. Intimacy and sex. There can be boundary lines around that about what you find acceptable in the bedroom and what you don't, or what's comfortable, what's uncomfortable to you. Those can be very important, because you could end up maybe doing something to hurt your spouse. I know the typical sort of male female kind of situation is females are like crock pots. And again, this is just generalizations. It may not be the case in your relationship, but typically females are like crock pots. So they might need constant, not constant, but they might need throughout the day just some snuggles or some hand holding or some kind and maybe sensual words, where sometimes men maybe don't need that as much. Men typically, we're like microwaves, so we can turn off and on at will. So we don't maybe typically need that as much. But again, that's a situation where just communicating, talking about it can be extremely helpful. And you can set those boundaries up to say, hey, when we're in the bedroom and I don't know, maybe I'm reading a book, let that be a signal to you that I'm just not really in the mood. But if we go to bed, we turn out the lights, and I'm not looking at my phone or my book, that's probably a signal that, hey, I'm open to this. And again, you're not going to get it right every time. It's not going to work for you every time. But again, if you can have these proactive conversations, set some parameters up, it can be a lot healthier for you. Digital and social media and texting, those are big. You can think about the time frame or the frequency with which you're on these devices. It might be like what you say versus what you don't say. I know Heather and I, for a while, we had this thing where, and we still do to some degree, where she's not going to be texting a male individually and I'm not going to be texting a female individually. Now, again, it's a little bit tougher now because if you've got a coworker or maybe even a boss that's of the opposite sex, maybe you two have worked out that, hey, texting is okay as long as it's completely business related. We're not going to be talking about what we're doing for vacation or what the family's doing, but be above board about that. Talk about it. I'm not asking you to be rigid. But if it works for you, great, then do that. Then say, you know what, absolutely zero texting with members of the opposite sex, and that might be better for you. And then two, if you've had a betrayal of trust or there has been an affair that's happened, you probably are going to want to clamp down on these things a lot more. So there may be a little bit less tolerance for some of these things that I'm talking about. But if you've built up a wealth of trust over the years, they often say that trust is gained in drops, but it's lost in buckets. But if you've built up that trust, like Heather and I would say, and I'm speaking for her, we're talking just you and I right now, we've built up an immense amount of trust for each other. And so there is a little bit more wiggle room on some things, whereas maybe it's not as sensitive for us as it might be for other couples. Now, it was in the beginning of our relationship, no doubt, because some things that had happened in our past that we were working through, but we've built up the trust and it's come in drops over years. For you, again, that may not be the case. You might be in a little bit of a different situation. So obviously, again, keep going back to it, but communicating with your spouse. Let's talk about how to set and communicate boundaries biblically. That's important. Number one, the most important thing you can do is pray together. Seek God's wisdom, like actually pray about the boundaries and establish unity. Ask for unity because that's going to be the most difficult part because one of you is going to have one thought about a boundary, the other is going to have another thought. And then there's potential for tension and conflict and discord based upon those differences. James 1:5 says that if any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God. So that's what we've got to do. And it's funny, I don't know, this maybe doesn't have anything to do with boundaries, but when Heather and I are setting up for our podcasting and our videos, it gets completely frustrating getting all the cameras and the lighting and the sound and what are we going to say and where are we going to sit and how are we going to bounce ideas off of each other. And so the tension can increase, it can start to flare on us. And so we have to be careful with that. And one thing that I'm making a commitment to do now, you and I are talking, is I'm going to pray more about this before we start the setup. And so it's going to be all about God. Please help us get this set up. Let's have the video and the lighting and the sound correct. I pray for unity between the two of us so that we may be gentle and kind with each other and know what we're saying. So that's very important, praying together. Communicating clearly. Don't mean to go back to kindergarten with you. You may have heard this before, but use I statements. If you're upset about something, be clear about your feelings and then try to describe in concrete terms what the other person is doing. So I'll give you an example. It could be something like, I feel not heard when I ask you to empty the cat litter and it doesn't happen or you don't do it. Rather than saying something like, you never empty the cat litter, or it's so irritating that you're lazy. You see where we're going with that? It's if I'm not saying how I feel and describing in concrete terms what you've done, you can have this tendency to start to get into this place where you're describing the person's personality and how they are. And it could be true. Maybe 99% of the time, your spouse is not doing what you ask them to do. The issue always comes back to, what are you going to get in return when you say that thing that you say? And I've often found that I typically don't get the response that I'm looking for when I say that thing, when I'm making that comment about your personality, or this is what I notice you doing. It typically is always a defensive response or maybe an angry response back. Now, potentially you may have gotten to the end of your rope and you just can't take it anymore, and it's just enough is enough. And maybe, God, Jesus, he had righteous anger. He didn't like that the people were turning his house, he called it, into a den of thieves where they were making money at the expense of the poor. So he had some righteous anger and he flipped over tables. And so there's potential that maybe that happens, but let's hope it's not very often. I want to say in the Bible, I don't know, that may be the only instance of his righteous anger, quote unquote. And this kind of goes into be firm but loving. Again, state your boundary with kindness. So this is what I need. Proverbs 4:23 says, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. So again, making sure that you're coming at this from the right place. Oftentimes, those of us that maybe lack empathy can oftentimes speak from our brain and leave our heart out of it. But we need a combination of those things. Again, like I talked about a lot about trust, truth and love, establishing consequences. And again, for boundaries, maybe you don't need to establish consequences immediately. It could start from, okay, here's what I'm thinking in my mind, what I would like to see, or maybe how I will react. And then I guess if it keeps happening and your boundary keeps crossing, then you may say, you know what, I need to communicate my boundary and I'm going to communicate my consequences. Or you could even start out with, no, I'm not going to communicate any consequences. In fact, I'm not going to have any consequences for you doing this thing. But then maybe if it happens repeatedly, then all of a sudden, okay, now I've got to have some consequences that I communicate to you. And then also be prepared for some pushback. And this goes with boundaries with your spouse. This goes with boundaries with your children. This goes with boundaries with anybody in your life. Change for people is uncomfortable. And if you've been that doormat or you've always laid down for people, it's going to be shocking. They're going to see and hear what you're saying. They're going to feel this firmness, and they're not going to like it. And they're going to potentially question, what's wrong with you? What's your problem? And there's not a problem with you. Again, boundaries can be healthy when done appropriately, done correctly, and done with love. Again, you're going to get some initial resistance on this. With your spouse, with anybody else, you might want to temper that with, hey, I love you, I appreciate you, I love our relationship, I want it to continue, but here's something that is upsetting to me, and I'm wondering if we can work on this together. And then you approach it like that, like a collaborative effort, so to speak. And again, you just slowly amp up the consequences as you move along. If again that boundary line keeps being encroached upon, it's your house. Maybe there's a dog next door that is struggles with biting people, and it's come over onto your property several times, and maybe growling and foaming at the mouth. Maybe the first boundary is, I've got to go talk to the owner. Can you keep your dog in your yard? The dog keeps coming over. Okay. Maybe you try it again. Doesn't work. Okay, then maybe you get the police involved. Or maybe you say, you know what, I'm going to build a fence around my property line. Whatever it might be that you've got to do. So again, the consequences can get ramped up. And then again, boundaries aren't a one-time discussion. They have to be repeated. You have to be consistent about it. You might need to continue to communicate about it for sure, because, and it's not really other people's faults. It's like, we're all busy. We all got things going on. We slip up. We're human. I've been married to Heather for over 20 years now, and I know the things that she doesn't like. I know the things that bother her, and I still continue to do them. It's like Paul in the Bible when he talks about, why do I do the things I don't want to do? And then why do I not do the things I want to do? And it's human nature. Again, not trying to give us a pass. We've got to try to get better. We're works in progress. But again, just knowing that we're human beings, we're flawed, we're imperfect. And I think God knows that. I think our spouses know that. But again, God's ability to withstand these difficulties is infinite. Human beings' ability to withstand these issues is not infinite. So that's where we've got some work to do to try to be careful about what we're doing. I think some of the fruits of healthy boundaries, what you're going to notice, again, there's going to be maybe some tension, some difficulty as you're working through these things in the beginning, but typically at some point you're going to start to feel order, you're going to start to feel peace, you're going to start to feel respect, and that's really God flowing through you as long as you're keeping Him and His presence in this situation. You're going to be able to grow individually in your marriage, but you're also going to be able to increase the union with which you have together. I think about it with two circles. In a marriage, you don't want the circles not to touch. You don't want there to be space in between the circles. Those are couples that are disconnected, that are drifting apart. You don't want to have circles that completely overlap, because what does that mean? That means that one person is in control, the other person is not in control, and there can be issues with that, and that can get to be an abusive situation where, again, at the far ends of the spectrum, we're talking about the person that overlaps the other completely and envelops the other person is a narcissist, and then the person that is underneath that, you might call that codependent, or it's toxic behavior that they're continuing to tolerate when they shouldn't be. The most healthy place for a relationship to be when we think about these circles is they want to overlap. I think that's called concentric circles, if I'm not mistaken, where there is a little bit of an overlap and there are things that you do in unison, but then there are also things that you do individually. For example, with Heather and I love to run. And I honestly love to run by myself, which again, maybe sounds selfish, but I don't really think it is. She doesn't think it is because she doesn't like running. In fact, she was told by the doctor to be careful about it because of a bone situation for her. But I absolutely love it. And technically, I guess I don't really run alone. I do a lot of praying, I do a lot of talking to God, but I absolutely love it. And so if that were an area that she would encroach upon and say, nope, I have to absolutely run with you and I have to run with you every time, that would probably be getting into my individual part of the circle. And then that would be where her circle would start to slowly overtake my circle, probably an area that I don't want it to be overtaken in. So again, growing individually, strengthening your union. And so look at boundaries as a tool for really deepening your love, building a resilient, Christ honoring marriage. And if you do these things, I no doubt will see your marriage flourish. I hope you've been encouraged by this episode. I want to ask you, and I'm going to put a link in today's show notes and episode description of a communication workbook that we are offering for free to you. It's called 10 Practical Steps to Communication, and it's really going to help you kind of kick off this discussion about boundaries in a very healthy way. And the more you talk about these things, the better it's going to be and the easier it's going to be. So make sure you pick that up. Again, I'll provide the link wherever you are listening or watching this video. And with that, I thank you so much for listening and watching, and we'll see you next time. Take care.